Where did the myth that science and faith are in conflict come from? In the late 19th century, two very influential books were published. John Uильям Дрейпер's book, History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, was published in 1874. Then in 1896, Эндрю Диксона Уайт's book, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, was published. Both these books pushed the conflict myth.
The conflict view of the history of science and religion from Andrew Dikson White and John Uильям Дрейпер is really pretty bad. It's very bad scholarship, both from the point of view of the trees and the forest. What I mean by that is that the larger picture one gets from reading Draper and White is that the history of science and religion is a narrative of unending, inevitable conflict, with the church constantly losing to science, and the implication being science someday will completely supplant the church. That's the forest. The individual trees are the alleged facts and viewpoints that are presented in the book on the part of historical individuals. And both of those things, the forest and the trees, are simply a mess. The larger picture is wrong, partly because the smaller pictures are so wrong. But also the larger picture in and of itself is wrong. The idea of an overarching conflict of science and religion as a meta-narrative fits accurately so few instances in the history of religion and science that so much that's happened of the interaction is completely left out by such a metaphor. So it oversimplifies to the point of being badly erroneous. I'd like to give an example of the bad trees in Andrew Dikson White. I'm going to turn to a paragraph, a single paragraph in Andrew Dikson White's book, which is called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. And I will read even just selectively from that paragraph. White says, and I quote, "While Lutheranism was thus condemning the theory of the earth's movement, other branches of the Protestant Church did not remain behind. Calvin took the lead in his commentary on Genesis by condemning all who asserted that the earth is not at the center of the universe. He clinched the matter by the usual reference to the first verse of the 93rd Psalm, and asked, quote, 'Who will venture to place the authority of Copernicus above that of the Holy Spirit?' Unquote. Then jumping to the end of that same paragraph, where he's speaking again about the Copernican system and the views of some who reject it, he says, to close the paragraph, 'And even John Wesley declared the new ideas to, quote, 'tend toward infidelity,' unquote." Well, that's a remarkable paragraph, remarkable for what it does with history that never happened. The quotation by John Calvin, alleged to be a reference to the 93rd Psalm, is not found anywhere in John Calvin. No one's ever found it, and no one is going to. It didn't exist. Calvin never said anything at all about the Copernican system. The second quotation, allegedly giving a view of John Wesley, who is supposed to have rejected Copernicanism according to A.D. White, is based on a prior historical work of someone else who didn't know how to read primary sources very well. And that particular reference is based on a sermon that John Wesley gave in which he mentioned the idea of the plurality of worlds, the hypothesis that there might be more than one universe. That's an idea that was popular in the 18th century in the wake of Copernicanism. Wesley thought it wasn't a very good idea and wasn't very well supported by science. He even quoted the great astronomer Christian Huygens against the idea of the plurality of worlds. That's the idea that he was rejecting in the passage that White seems to think was about Copernicanism itself. John Wesley was a Copernican. John Calvin might have never heard of Copernicus, although I think he probably did, but certainly never mentioned him by name in anything that he wrote, and never opposed the Copernican idea per se. Certainly never said anything attributed to him by White. So that's just an illustration, a single paragraph about two very minor people in the history of theology, John Calvin and John Wesley, neither of whom said what White says they say. In Wesley's case, he held the opposite view from the one which White attributes to him. And in Calvin's case, we don't know what he thought about Copernicus, but he certainly never said what White says he said. So that's an example. There are many others I could bring in of the really shoddy scholarship in that book.
These two very popular and highly influential books did a lot to advance the myth that science and faith are in conflict, and yet they're full of poor scholarship and facts that aren't facts at all. At about the same time as Andrew Dikson Uwaita's book was published, some of the most important discoveries in physics were being made in Cambridge, England. Many of them by scientists who saw no conflict between their science and their Christian faith. We'll say more about this next time.